But once it is understood, what precisely is understood? Does this kind of verbiage mean anything at all outside itself? Later, Heidegger appears to contradict himself with the uncharacteristically clear assertion that talking is talk about something. But we must remember that this about something is beyond the reach of mere logic. Being with belongs to being in the world, which in every case maintains itself in some definite way of concernful being with one another. This raises the question of whether meaning itself has any being in such language. Modern philosophers have been far from unanimous in their answer to this problem. In 1923, Heidegger was appointed Associate Professor of Philosophy at the small historic University of Marburg in central Germany. He had a growing reputation, but his appointment to a professorship at the comparatively early age of 33 was largely due to the influence of Husserl. Heidegger quickly established himself as a cult figure. Phenomenology was very much the latest philosophical craze among the students, and his lectures attracted an avid following. Heidegger delivered his lectures dressed in South German folk costume, a loden jacket and knickerbockers. This tolerable eccentricity was intended to emphasize the Germanness and folkish authenticity of his approach. Here was a man whose being was grounded in the time-honored traditions of the land. During vacations, he would retire to the mountains of the Black Forest, living in an alpine chalet which he had built for himself. Not literally, all the building work was supervised by his wife, Elfriede, in between looking after their 2 children. Here, amidst plain but far from primitive domesticity, surrounded by the timeless world of unspoiled nature, he could reflect upon the nature of being, high above the shallow corruptions of modern life. Meanwhile, fewer than 70 miles down the road from Marburg, at the equally historic University of Göttingen, equally incomprehensible speculations were being carried out into the nature of being. The resident physicists, spearheaded by the 25-year-old boy wonder Werner Heisenberg, were literally inventing the entire field of quantum mechanics. Scientifically, philosophically, politically, and artistically, revolutionary developments were occurring in Germany, where post-war debt was plunging society into the chaos of hyperinflation. At one point, in June 1923, when the bakeries opened in the morning, a loaf of bread cost 20,000 marks. By the time they closed that evening, the same loaf cost 5 million marks. Not surprisingly, artists, philosophers, and scientists were not the only ones who were coming to their own radical conclusions concerning the nature of being. In 1924, Heidegger became aware of an attractive young Jewish girl attending his lectures. In consequent discussions, it soon emerged that, despite her evident immaturity, she was by far the most philosophically gifted of his students. This was Hannah Arendt, who came from the East Prussian city of Königsberg. Within weeks, their intense philosophical discussions had begun straying into equally obscure and problematic emotional waters. Hannah Arendt was just 18, and Heidegger was 35 when they became lovers. From the wording of Heidegger's letters, it is evident that this was the first time in his life he had experienced full-blown passion, in all its physical, spiritual, and emotional aspects. It was a powerful revelation to him. Before this, the repressed young professor in his buttoned-up peasant jacket had characterized himself as possessed of an inherited reserve and awkwardness. Writing to a colleague, he had declared, "I live in solitude," despite the presence at home of his wife and 2 growing sons. Although technically both Prussians, Hannah and Heidegger's wife Elfriede could not have been more different. Hannah came from a cosmopolitan Jewish family, which was both liberal and assimilated to the German bourgeois way of life. Elfriede was descended from the imperial-minded and conservative Junker officer caste, a hotbed of racist and German supremacist illusions masquerading as ideals. It is clear that with Hannah, Heidegger discovered an entirely new realm of being within himself. This must surely have affected his understanding of being and what it meant. Yet none of it directly entered his philosophy of being. One can only assume that it informed his vision in a more oblique way. There is no mistaking his feelings. The brittle shell cracked open to reveal the gooey yolk of unfulfilled love. Hannah became everything to him, but most of all she became his muse. Heidegger was in the middle of writing the great work in which he was setting down his original ideas in all their entirety, and his discussions with Hannah of the central points of his philosophy proved an inspiration. Hannah, for her part, was overwhelmed with love and admiration for her charismatic master, who was almost twice her age. My characterization of one as Hannah and the other as Heidegger is intended to be indicative, not chauvinistic. But this could be no ordinary love affair. Although Marburg was officially a city, it was in reality a very small provincial town with a population of less than 20,000. During university vacations, the town virtually closed down. Everybody watched everybody, and the university itself was markedly conservative in its mores, as indeed was the entire German academic tradition, which was highly protective of its social status. By having an affair with a young student, Heidegger was risking not only his job, but his entire career, the only time in his life when he ever came near to doing such a thing. Heidegger and Hannah were forced to conduct their affair in the utmost secrecy. His letters, filled with complex instructions, preceded their every tryst in her attic room. The Alpine uniform was presumably camouflaged beneath a despised urban raincoat. Elfrida, who resented all of her husband's female students, was only slightly more suspicious of the Jewess. Even so, their secret continued to remain undetected. There were a number of near scrapes. But after a year of such nail-biting tension, Heidegger's nerve gave way. Self-preservation eventually got the better of his emotions. He suggested to Hannah that she move to Heidelberg to continue her studies. Hannah dutifully, if regretfully, obeyed. They continued to meet on an irregular basis. When he was travelling to deliver a public lecture at another university, Heidegger would scheme for a stolen few hours with her at some village inn. Upon his summons, Hannah would drop everything and hurry to meet him. But she was all too aware of what was happening. She began an affair with a fellow student in the hope of shocking Heidegger into a commitment, but he did not respond as she had hoped. A few years later, she would marry her student lover. Despite this, Heidegger continued to hold a central place in her wounded affections. Although he was safely back in his shell, Heidegger too would never be able to forget what Hannah had once meant to him. This is more than just sentimental speculation. Over the years, these remnant feelings would continue to play a crucial, if ambiguous, role in both their lives. In 1927, Heidegger finally published the work in which he set down his new philosophy. This was Being and Time, in German, Sein und Zeit, which he dedicated to Edmund Husserl in Friendship and Admiration. The book opens with a quotation from Plato. "Clearly you have long been aware of what you mean when you use the word being. We, on the other hand, who used to think we understood it, have now become perplexed." Heidegger begins by laying out his argument with extreme care. The point he is trying to establish is slippery in the extreme, and if it is not grasped at the outset, the increasingly dense argumentation of the ensuing 480 pages may elude the reader completely. He opens with a series of questions. Do we in our time have an answer to the question of what we really mean by the word being? He answers this question with an emphatic no. In German, keineswegs, literally no ways. This point is important as Heidegger places great emphasis on the root meaning of words. His intention is to show us a way through to the understanding of being. Heidegger continues, "Thus it is apt that we should raise once more the question of the meaning of being." The emphasized final phrase is the central notion of the entire book. Even at this early stage we may find ourselves asking, what on earth is he talking about? Does all this mean anything at all? Heidegger was evidently aware that his argument might from the outset provoke such rational responses. He immediately seeks to forestall any dismissive response we might have by showing that we are missing the point. He continues, "Nowadays, are we even perplexed by our inability to understand the word being?" Once again, the answer is an emphatic keineswegs. Unlike Heidegger, many of us are inclined to find nothing puzzling about this concept. We simply accept it for what it is, in a rational manner. We don't attempt to understand it in any profound sense. We have no difficulty with it. A thing either has being, that is, it exists, or it does not. A horse exists, a unicorn does not.